Is it safe to say, this is from an Anglican, that Anglican scholar I quoted to you earlier, Rawlinson. He says this about the Holy Spirit. In the New Testament, there can be no doubt that the other strain of thought in which the Spirit is regarded in the main as an influence, gift, or power sent by the Father and the Son, and not as a distinct person. It says large amounts of text represent the Spirit as an impersonal force, both in Acts and Paul.
Hmm.
Is he accurate in that? This is a Trinitarian.
Wow. Wow. This is a good one. So this is what I would say. This is what I would say. And as you're gonna expect me to say now, it's in my book actually. I have this thing where I talk about full spectrum view of the Spirit, a full spectrum view of the Spirit. The answer to that question is yes, yes, and yes. Imagine a spectrum. We're going to go from 0 to 100, right? And by the way, I shouldn't say 0 to 100. Let's take all of the references to the divine spirit in the Bible. You're talking about 369. 369. That's law, prophets, writings, New Testament. 369, right? If we were to go through all 369, beginning with Moses all the way to Revelation, this is what you're going to find. 85%, in fact, slightly more than that, but let's be conservative. 85% of those are what I call objective references. What God is, what God gives, what God puts, pours, sends, all of that objectively, right? 85%. In fact, in the Old Testament, it's almost complete. All of the references are objective references. I use Numbers 11 as one of the best examples because every Trinitarian struggles to try to get a subjective reference out of Numbers 11, where God says to Moses, I will come down and I will take some of the Spirit that is upon you and put it upon the 70 elders, right? And they're struggling there because that's like, wait a minute, I'm going to take some of the person and put part of the person. It's clearly being used. It's apportionment language. You quoted one of my other favorite verses, 1 John 4:13, in the Greek text. In the Greek text, God says, I will abide. It's talking about the Father. He said he sent our Son. He sent the Son. And we know that he abides in us because he has given to us from out of his own Spirit. All of those words are there in the Greek text. There's no, that you can't duck them, you can't dodge them. Even the New English translation puts a note and says, this is apportionment. God gives us a portion of his Spirit, right? Now, that's 85% of the time. The other 15%, there are subjective references, right? I'll give a classic example that Trinitarians use all the time. Acts chapter 5. You have not lied to men, you have lied to God. Why is Satan so hard, filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit, right? And you have not lied to men, you have lied to God. Peter there is using a parallel, but it's not what they use it for. They want to say this proves that the Holy Spirit is God. The Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God. I guarantee you, any proof text of the Trinity always has Acts chapter 5 because they got to come up with some verse. Now, I believe that the Spirit is divine because I believe that God is Spirit and God's Spirit is divine. We're talking about God's own Spirit. But what happens is when you read Acts 5, and I think I may have lost you for a second here, Peter, but in Acts chapter 5, it's parallel. The God, which is always the Father in the book of Acts and Luke, is the Spirit. And we can go through other passages that make that point. My last point, Peter, was that 15% of those references, a small percentage, 15% are subjective, like Acts 5. God is the Holy Spirit, right? And it's funny. We say God is Spirit, God is holy. And a lot of Trinitarians, they laugh. They say it's simple, but I say it's so simple because it's sound. We call God the Holy One. We can call him the Holy Spirit. Jesus can pray to the Father and say, the Holy Father. In John 17, Holy Father, right? In Matthew 10, verse 20, it talks about how the Spirit of your Father will give you what to say in the hour of persecution. So we have no problem saying those things. And same thing can be said for Christ. 2 Corinthians 3, the Lord is the Spirit, right?
Is that Spirit, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So he says it twice there. By the way, you ever want to get a Trinitarian on that passage? I've studied that passage, Greek. I've gone to the Septuagint. I've looked at it up and down. There's no room out. There's no wiggle room out of that passage. And you can rarely find a Trinitarian who will debate that passage publicly. I've had them admit to me that my view, or our view, is the correct view, or is the view that's more defensible, but they will never say, I say, hey, can we have this publicly said? Can we say this in a debate? They will not let me quote them, and they won't let me debate them publicly on that passage. But the Lord is the Spirit. And Paul says it similarly in 1 Corinthians 15, where, Christ is a life-giving Spirit. And so my argument is 15% of them are subjective. And like in Romans 8, the Spirit intercedes. Well, I believe the Spirit of Christ intercedes to the Father. Only that same word is used for Christ later. Christ is at the right hand interceding for us.
He's the intercessor. And the
There's
Spirit
only
is
one
the
mediator.
intercessor. So it's obvious one and the same. The Lord
There's
is
only
that
one.
Spirit. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
And so we always have that interchange. You quoted one earlier about Paul, well, Paul talks about God's Spirit as his mind. When you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 2 or Romans chapter 11, you see Paul use it. He has no problem talking about God's Spirit as God's mind. And in 1 Corinthians 2, he says, we have the mind of Christ. And so
And he's quoting Isaiah.
He's quoting Isaiah.
40:13.
That's correct. That's correct. And it's a direct substitution for spirit. When you put them side by side in the Greek, you're like, oh my goodness. He's saying mind of Christ is the same as Spirit of the Lord. Spirit is mind. And we can obviously say God knows the mind of his Son. He put the Spirit of his Son in us. And also say we can talk about the Spirit of the Father, because the Father he's not left out too. He says, we will come and make our home. There's a we. There's a we there.